What's up, everyone? This is Pete Clark, aka Characters, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. This is episode number 78, and today I am not on my own anymore. I have a friend tonight, and his name is Adam. He is a poker tool creator, and he's going to be talking to us about his new tool, along with his poker journey so far and some other stuff. How's it going, Adam? Good to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm doing good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well, thanks. It's Sunday, and I completely forgot that we were recording, so I kind of had to jump back into work mode there, like all of a sudden, and get my poker thinking cap on. But yeah, all good.
For sure.
So let's start with a little bit of background on you. So I do want to talk about this app that you have built, which is like a little bit like one of your like what Poker Stove was back in the day, but with different features and a bit more advanced, and you'll talk us through that later. But what led you on the road to eventually like building poker software? Where did it all begin? Like, how did you first become fascinated with the game?
Yeah, so I met a girl and I ended up moving to Vegas, and so my kind of life plan is to start a lot of different startups and also to live in a lot of different places. So I'm here in Vegas, and I thought to myself, like, I may as well take up poker. Like, I'm probably only going to be here for 3 or 4 years or something like that. So for that reason, I took up poker. And my first year in Vegas, I was studying computer science. So I'm a self-taught developer, and I took a year off to kind of, solidify my computer science skills. And towards the end of that, I needed to get my web development skills back because they were rusty. So I needed a project. And I previously tried to download Flopzilla, but because I'm on a Mac, I wasn't able to do that. So at this point, when I started I needed a project to build, I kind of thought to myself, why don't I kind of build my own version of Flopzilla?
Right.
So this journey started.
Cool. So before you even got to that, then, like, how much poker have you played, like, on the path to eventually deciding that you were going to build this app?
Yeah, so I've been working on this for like 2 years, and I started, like, I moved to Vegas like 3 years ago.
Okay.
So there was like a year where I was mostly doing computer science stuff, but like a little bit of dabbling in poker. And then when I started building the app, I got more serious into poker. So for these previous 2 years, I mean, most of my time is on the app, but then I also read books and study poker also.
Nice. So what kind of, would I be right if I guessed that you have like a background, like your degree was in that sort of thing, like software engineering, or is this just something you do in your spare time?
Yeah, my degree is actually in neuroscience.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I thought I wanted to do that initially, but my sophomore year, I realized that it wasn't for me. So I kind of I taught myself to code. I didn't really study it in college, and I worked on a different startup in college, so I kind of have a little experience with that.
Nice, yeah. Coding to me is like one of the most counterintuitive things ever. Like I think I've just taught myself to be able to understand like the basics of HTML and a little tiny
Yeah,
bit of CSS, and these are just like, for anyone that doesn't know anything about coding, that knows even less than me, these are just like the absolute like most basic functionalities of how you could get like a bit of text onto a page and slightly get it modified or printed in a PDF or whatever. So I do that because I write books, but yeah, I have this friend that's been on the podcast with me a few times who is just specializes in coding. Like, he does it for his job, and he is the kind of guy who he'll probably listen to this and disagreeing with it, but in my opinion, he is the kind of guy that is like a massive workaholic. Like, his work ethic is just through the roof, and he will quite happily consider like a night of working and ordering pizza like a good night. So how do you shape up to that? Are you of the sort of work for 13 hours straight kind of coder, or are you more of the work in normal doses like you would in another profession? What do you think?
yeah. So for most of my life, I've been the workaholic type. Um, yeah, and then there was a point maybe like a year or two ago, or maybe 3 years ago. Like, there was some point where it just got to be too much. um, I was starting to get a little bit burned out, and it was just too much. And I wanted to focus on being healthier in like other aspects of my life. So I tried to cut down. But recently, my app, I've kind of been launching it. So it's been like an extra amount of work. So recently, I've been doing 10, 12 hours a day.
Yeah, and that can that can lead to burnout. Like it creeps up on you, doesn't? Then suddenly you're just like, oh my god, like I don't want to work today. I've just like overdone it, and you suddenly just need that break to reset or whatnot.
Right. And then for me, like I do, like poker study isn't counted in like my work hours. So like I'll do my programming, and then I'll try to study poker and like play a little poker too.
Cool. So what do you play? What's your main format?
So mostly online. Right now, I've been doing an L50 online, and I've kind of worked my way up to that. But once in a while, I'll play live. I'll play 1-2.
Cool. So were you part of the kind of conventional start at the lowest limit and grind your way up rung by rung on the ladder kind of approach then to online poker?
Yeah, absolutely. I started at NL2, and I really try to make sure that I have a big enough sample size of winning to move up.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the opposite, I guess, because I've never played lower than 25 NL, and I've rarely played lower than 50 or 100 NL, and I think that was because back in the day, the games were that soft that you could maybe jump in at 50 and be okay and survive if you had like some idea what you're doing, but probably not so much the case anymore. What sort of advantages or disadvantages has that slow and steady from the ground up approach yielded for you in your poker journey so far, would you say?
Yeah, so I was talking to a friend about this before, and I think there's like a lot of people who, like, let's take someone who plays like 1-2, for example, and they've kind of played that game their whole life. Like, their poker skill set is very narrow. Like, they might only know how to beat that game.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think like poker is important to be able to adjust to different types of opponents and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so playing at different limits has kind of given me a little bit of that skill set where I can adjust to different types of opponents. But at the same time, I still haven't gotten high enough where, I have to really worry about aggressive free betters. Like the people in my game don't three bet too frequently. They're not the type to like barrel you too much. So I haven't reached the point where like I've, developed all the skill sets.
Got you, yeah. And I think another thing that can happen with people that grind their way up step by step is that the certain aspects of, say, 10NL or 5NL and things like that can be very nitty. Like they can just run a very nitty meta game, you could say, between the regs, right? So like in a pre-flop spot, it's just like taboo to felt queens in like most situations, or like 4-betting jacks, or shoving tens over a 4-bet is just like something that is like a huge no-no. There's things like that spill into post flop as well. So have you found yet that there are any habits that you got playing the real nano stake, micro stakes, that were unhealthy, like when you hit say 25 or 50 NL?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this. I worry that I fold too often. So there's kind of like the idea that at smaller stakes, like when someone puts in a big bet, that they have it, and like they're not bluffing at a high enough frequency to bluff catch. So my tendency is definitely to fold when someone puts in a big bet. But recently I've kind of been worrying about that. I kind of worry that people might figure that out and like take advantage of that. So that's kind of what my thoughts are there.
Yeah, I guess it depends on sample. I mean, what kind of sample do you have on most of the regs in your pool? Is it like a small pool, or is it like PokerStars, like a big pool?
It's a small pool of players, and I don't do a good enough job of like tracking stats on them. So I play on WorldSeriesOfPoker.com, and there's no HUD.
Right.
And yeah, I try to keep stats, but like I don't really have that great of a reads on certain players.
Mm-hmm. But I guess you can sort of replace stats with like manual human tracking, which would be more like taking notes on tendencies and frequencies and stuff like that instead, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that side of the game probably becomes a lot more important for guys like you and any listeners at home who are playing on these HUDless sites. Like, just because there's no HUD, it doesn't mean that, if there's a small pool, that you can't end up being exploited or exploiting your opponents, but it does mean that you're going to need to see more sort of showdowns, right, to like glean the information, because it's just not going to come to you in the form of like passively being dealt a bunch of HUD stats, even when you're not watching the hand. Like in Zoom, you can fold, and then the HUD is just like goes away, does its thing, gathers all the data about what happened in that hand, reloads it into your HUD for the next hand, and you're basically mining in Zoom. You're like fast folding and gathering the data. It's kind of sick. I guess the pool you're talking about, Adam, is like the opposite. It's just kind of metagame, I suppose, becomes more of a thing, like the whole old school dynamism between two opponents, the ebb and flow, the sort of psychological factor. Would you say that's more prominent in these smaller pools that you play in?
Um, I'm not sure how like levelly it gets like that, but I think that like population reads is really important. I know you talk about that in the Grinder's Manual. Like you never have zero information. Like sometimes you have a player read, sometimes you have a population read. Like you know. So I think that when I play, I usually am thinking about like population reads.
Right. Yeah, and then the next level up from that, that's even more of a privilege to have, is when you see a showdown. Like, for example, I think like one showdown, you can argue, oh, it's just one time that you've seen your opponent's cards, but I think if they show you a specific thing, it can be like incredibly instrumental in how you develop your reads in the future. Let's say, for example, your opponent shows you like they bluff three streets, they like triple barrel you, and they show you like third pair, or like a really good ace high that still had some showdown value or something like that. Like say they take ace nine off and they go flop turn river, barrel 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 on like ace nine off on say 5-5 deuce 7-10, or just something like dry like that, and you're looking at ace nine like, okay, what else is this guy betting if he's doing that with ace nine? Is he randomizing and mixing in a 4% betting range with ace nine offsuit, or is he betting every single combo of ace nine offsuit and every other hand that doesn't have that has less showdown value? And I think like the answer is quite clearly it's the latter, right? Like if someone looks to be that unbalanced, they probably are, and we should assume that they are. So showdowns are probably really key, like for gaining a bigger edge, and then just like note taking those showdowns in a way that helps you, right? Like maybe developing a shorthand if you haven't already might be a good idea or something. I don't know, just my 2 cents. But that's how I'd adapt to that sort of pool.
I totally 100% agree, and I'm thinking about arguments I've had with people who say like, oh, you need to have a certain sample size before you can adjust, but I agree there's some situations where you only need a sample size of one. So like the thing that comes to my mind is like a 4-bet bluff. So if someone ever 4-bet bluffs, like that immediately tells me that they are capable of bluffing not only pre-flop but in a lot of other spots too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, extrapolating from one read. One that I really like, and I do this a lot, is if I see someone who c-bets a lot, and I may not know how they play the float flop situation where they're stab bet against the pre-flop raiser's check, which is kind of like the other side of the battle there. But if someone c-bet 4 times out of 5, or in a HUDless site you've just noticed them doing it like pretty frequently, the chances are they're not going to be like really nitty when checked to by pre-flop raisers. They're also going to bet like tons of their range there. So against a high c-better, like one thing I'll tell students to do is like just check like a lot of your hands in the small blind against big blind after you've opened and been called, because if he's going to bet 80% of hands when he should be betting 35% or something in GTO there, we can do so much check. We can check raise any two cards basically and have him fold like 60%, 65% to the check raise, and it's just like, it's insane. So I think that's a really good point that you made there, that one hand is enough, like one sample is enough. Like I get that a lot, even like on HUD sites, like on Stars or something, like a student that plays Zoom there will say something like, okay, so villain is 100 over one hand, he's a total unknown, and they're neglecting the fact that he just raised 5x in the cutoff, right, with no limpers. Or they're neglecting the fact that he limped the hijack, or sometimes they're even neglecting the fact that he started off with 83 big blinds in the hand. And that is everything. That is like a 98% chance that's a weaker player, and that shifts your optimal strategies, exploitative strategies massively. Right away, I'll start unbalancing my flop sizing if I've just got that read. I'll start like going bigger with higher EV hands and smaller with lower EV hands, with the idea that my opponent won't contract or expand his calling range enough as I flit between different sizes, different bet sizes. So just things like that. I think it's great to have that perspective that in some cases one hand is nothing, and in some other cases 20 hands is nothing, but in some cases one hand is everything and 20 hands is just overkill. And I think that's pretty spot on.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move forward a little bit then. So what are your kind of aspirations from poker? Like now you've got to 50 NL, you've like grinded your way up. This site is like, it's fairly soft, right? Like it attracts quite a few weaker players, like being WSOP, and it's just Nevada, is that right?
It's Nevada and New Jersey now. They just merged. I don't know. I think there's definitely some fishy players, but there's also some good players, so I think it's a mix.
Okay, cool. So where do you see yourself going? Like, how high would you want to play? Do you want to play professionally one day, or are you just playing for your own enjoyment of the game?
Yeah, so I've always had this mindset that I don't really aspire to be like that good at poker because like for me poker's fun when you're exploiting people and you're getting these reads and you're figuring out what they're doing wrong and stuff. But at least from what I understand is that when you get to like higher stakes, it's like very, very defensive and like balanced and trying to not get exploited yourself. And that's just not like as fun to me. So I don't really aspire to get to play like that high. I mean, NL 100, NL 200 would be fine online, and playing like 2-5 or 5-10 live, I'd be happy with.
Got you. So no aspirations to play the nosebleeds and lurk at the
Yeah,
table for 4 hours in case a weaker player turns up or anything like that.
right, right, right.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that at higher stakes, like, there's a little bit of a misconception here. Actually, I was listening to another podcast, not my own. That would be a bit weird. But someone else's podcast a couple of weeks back, and I remember like being on the bike at the gym, and just hearing like this top player. Like I think this is about 6 months old, so it's a guy that's one of the most successful tournament players online, like in the last few years, and he was sort of just saying how little GTO he actually does, and how little Pio he does, and how successful he is just based on the fact that a lot of regs think that they are playing something close to GTO, but they're miles away from it. Like, and he's also making the point that like there are bad regs at the higher stakes too. Like, yes, they're nowhere near as bad as the bad regs at 50 NL, but compared with
Yeah,
the good regs at like 1k NL, like, games like this, they are really bad, and there's still like there are regs in the pool that absolutely beat up on other regs and have a very big edge against them. Bear in mind as well, the rake is smaller in these games, right? So like your edge goes a bit further in that sense as well. But yeah, he was basically just saying like he's just like people are shit, like people suck, dude. Like people are awful at poker. Like they think they know what they're doing, but they don't. And like I do see where he's coming from because I just see even good players who are really intelligent and logical still being absolutely miles away from any kind of balanced strategy. So I don't know. I think you'd be surprised. I think like maybe it becomes a little bit less obvious and a bit more subtle how to exploit people or whatever. In the defensive game does happen a lot more, but I would say that it is not as like from where you are right now, like looking up at those games. I think when you get there, I'll say when, not if, like to fill you full of enthusiasm here. So when you get there, you'll probably see that like now that you know more, the leaks of these people are a lot more obvious, even though they're more subtle than the leaks of the guy at 50 NL that you're just crushing by making like one or two really distinct and clear adjustments. But yeah, like I think as well, like for me, there's a certain like beauty in the defensive side of the game because it's not just that you're trying to be balanced for balance sake, right? Like you do want to be balanced, but you want to do it in the way that gains the most EV against a random strategy. So, for example, if you look at a board like Jack 7-4, and then say you're button against big blind, and button starts c-betting, and big blind starts calling
yeah,
on the turn, which is a brick of some sort, let's say an offsuit deuce, but there's a couple of flush draws now. So say it's like Jack 7-4 with two hearts and one spade, and then the deuce of spades comes on the turn. So it's two flush draws, and button like overbets the pot, which is going to be a really common thing with two flush draws on the board when he's against capped range. He's going to do a lot of really, really big betting here in equilibrium. And
yeah,
then we get to the river, and the GTO is going to say, well, if you have king, queen of clubs, let's say the river is also a deuce or something, right? So let's say it's now Jack 7-4 deuce deuce, and both the spade and heart draws have missed. Well,
okay,
now button's going to start betting this polarized range, right? In the river, he's going to start like applying tons of pressure. He's going to
right,
value bet his overpairs. He's going to value bet his sets. He's going to value bet like his like ace jack or something like that. He's going to use really big sizes, and then he's
yeah,
going to bluff, right? But if he
right,
bluffs with the wrong hands, like even at GTO, like he could balance a bluffing range here, but he could be doing it with, let's say, king, queen of hearts that blocks like busted flush draws. That's going to be a terrible hand to bluff with, right? Because you're just eliminating all those busted flush draws from your opponent's range. Whereas if you do it with like king, queen of clubs, you're unblocking all the busted flush draws, and your EV is way higher. So that's kind of what I love about GTO. Like I get what you're saying. The defensive battle is maybe not quite as fulfilling or obviously fun, but I think
right,
there's a certain subtle like intricacy to it where even if you don't know what your opponent's doing, you can still make a blunder just by picking a lower EV part of your range to bluff with or something like that. I find that really cool. That's what kind of makes me drawn to GTO, I guess, as a topic in poker.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, and that's really interesting to hear what you said that at the higher stakes that they aren't actually that good. That kind of goes against what I had previously believed. I didn't realize that. And so now that you say that, I mean, now I'm thinking to myself, maybe I do want to go and try to play higher.
Yeah, I mean, you can see what the water's like when you get in it. You know, you can kind of test it and see how you feel. But I wouldn't say that like they're all terrible. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm
Yeah,
just saying that this pro I listened to who had this attitude that most poker players at the higher stakes were like quite bad, at least from his vantage point. So from his tower of being one of the better regs, he could see all of the leaks that the masses down below were making, kind of thing. So
yeah,
it may not be that those players are bad, like by our standards or your standards or someone's standard who's playing 100 NL or 10 NL or whatever the stake may be. It might just be that to the vantage point of someone who is much much stronger,
right,
they're bad. So
right.
maybe the idea here is that the game doesn't plateau out at everybody playing GTO defensively because
Yeah,
humans have such a hard time implementing that. There is still like a big skill scope. There's a large scope for skill disparity at the higher stakes because of how difficult it actually is to play anything like GTO. And there's still loads of scope to go wrong. Maybe you just need to be a way better player to see the people who are going wrong in those more subjectively subtle ways, I suppose. But yeah, see what
yeah.
it's like when you get up there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the software that you have built. So before you get into exactly what it is, what was the journey like? What was it that you saw working with other apps that made you think I can make something unique here that maybe fills a certain slot in the market?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that, like, when I started building this, I was thinking about the Mac users. So I see so much software out there that only works for Windows. And so that was kind of a big thought that I had initially is like I want to have things that are available to Mac users. And I know that there's some software is available for Mac users, but it's kind of I don't think it's that good, and I think that there's not that many options available. So that's something that I saw from the beginning. But then as I worked on it longer and longer, like I just thought to myself that there's even more opportunities. Like I can do better than the Windows software. Yeah, that's kind of my thought process there.
Cool. So in what ways did you feel that certain other softwares on Windows or Mac were deficient? Like what did you think that they maybe weren't quite giving to the user?
So one of like the big one that I have in mind is Flopzilla, and I think there's a lot that Flopzilla does that's really good, but then there's things that they do that aren't so good. And one of the things I really don't like about it is that so let's say that you want to select like top pair weak kicker hands, but you don't want to select like all of them. So maybe top pair weak kicker is like ace seven down to ace two, but like maybe you only want to select ace seven through ace five. If you want to do that in Flopzilla, it's like you have to take like multiple clicks. It's this thing called like advanced filtering, and it's not like intuitive. So with my app, what you can do is literally just click the cells that you want to select or deselect. So it's just as simple as point and click. So I think that that kind of makes the app a lot easier to use and a lot more fun to use.
Yeah, okay, cool, for sure. And there's certain programs that obviously do that as well. But I'm guessing that your app is combining that point and click functionality with some of the higher functionalities of Flopzilla. Like I know that
Yeah.
Flopzilla is more about sort of breaking hands post flop into groups. Like how often will my opponent have a pair on this flop? How often will he have air? How often will he have a gut shot? Is it more like using that functionality with the point and click cell grid?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does all of that and some more things also.
Okay. For someone who hasn't used any of these programs, who basically maybe studies just with Poker Tracker or just with maybe looking at sims on PioSolver but doesn't do any equity calculations or range building sims or anything like that, like you would do in Equilab or Flopzilla or anything, what would that bring to their game in your opinion? Like why do you need to do this kind of work in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think there's two big answers to that. And so one of them is like if you're using PIO solver, how do you pronounce that? Is it Pio Solver?
I think they want us to call it PO, but we don't. Like, PO doesn't have a nice ring to it, so the community's just been like, nah, screw that, man, it's PIO. We've rebranded it for you guys. There you go.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, if you're using Pio Solver, like to me, that gives you kind of the answer, but it doesn't give you the kind of thought process behind it so much. So I think that you can kind of combine those tools with tools like mine and Equilab and Flopzilla to kind of build your intuition as to like why certain hands are calls or raises or whatever. So yeah, that's part of it, and then the other part of it is just like we were saying before, exploitative poker is like a big part of the game, and you just told me that applies to higher stakes games as well. I mean, I was under the impression that it was all like GTO stuff, like super super defensive GTO at the higher stakes, but it seems like they're making enough mistakes where you can get exploitative on them. So
Absolutely.
I think it's yeah, I think it's important to have exploitative like studying as part of your routine.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, you can do node locking within PioSolver and stuff like that, but it is a little bit clumsy, and it's the kind of thing where when you node lock, like, there's a couple of reasons I don't think it's a fantastic way to work on your exploitative game. One is that when you node lock a strategy, you will usually be then looking at someone who has blundered and then reverted to optimal poker on the next two streets after that blunder. So it's kind of ridiculous. It's like, I'm going to put in this fish's strategy on the flop, like the fish is checking back every single hand apart from air and betting air, and you're making Pio do that, and then Pio is then being put in this landscape and being like, oh shit, man, now I need to come up with the most high EV way of playing this bullshit range that I've been given. And that's kind of just bizarre. Like, that doesn't happen in reality. So I kind of agree with you that I think that people should use other programs as well, like your software. This would probably be a good time just to tell everyone what your software is called.
Yeah, it's called Premium Poker Tools, and it's a website. So you just go to premiumpokertools.com.
Cool. And how do people pay for that?
So it's $5 a month after a 14-day free trial. So you don't have to enter your credit card with the free trial. That's just to make it easy to get started. And then once you're on the free trial, there's like a subscribe button. So you go there to pay.
Awesome. And then you presumably, for as long as you're playing poker, you can pay your $5 a month. Then if I decide that I don't want to play poker anymore, I'm too jaded with the game, I'm on a terrible downswing, or I get a job that's too demanding or whatever, I can just unsubscribe and no longer pay for the software.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right, sounds good. So let's talk a little bit about, what was I going to say there? Yeah, let's discuss, like, if I'm using this software, what I should actually do, because I feel like with students sometimes there are a few pitfalls here when you're using this kind of software. I'm going to start us off. I'll give you a pitfall that I think people might succumb to when they're using software, and you can tell me how they might avoid that in your software or whatever. So I think one of the biggest things that people do wrong is over specificity and over assumptiveness.
Yes.
So like
Yes.
saying villain's range is these combos.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
on the flop it's these combos, and then it's exactly these combos, and I have 27% equity. It's like, what?
Right.
If you can soul read how much equity you have against an unknown player's range, you're doing something a lot better than I am. Like, you should be coaching me, right? So
Yeah.
how do I, if I'm using the software as a student, how do I avoid just like falling into this rabbit hole of giving him an exact range and then making a bunch of unjustified assumptions?
Yeah, I think you're like totally, totally, totally spot on with this. I've like sat with people and worked through the app with them, and they'll spend like an hour like getting the exact perfect like pre-flop range. And yeah, so what I think the way to do it instead is like the way that I think about it is to zoom out and think about how you perform against different ranges and kind of different tendencies. So like for example, if I'm deciding whether or not to bluff catch, I'll kind of think to myself like, okay, what if they're really bluff heavy, or like what if they're really value heavy, and then like what if they're somewhere in the middle, and I kind of play around and see how I'm doing against these different ranges, and then from there I can kind of get a feel for whether I want to call or fold.
Yeah, and presumably you can sort of assume lots of different hypotheticals and also plug in different hole cards for yourself to see like which parts of your range have more equity bluff catching, and that'll encompass things like blockers as well, right? That'll like show you a lot of the stuff you would get from Pio, but like you say, maybe it'll explain a bit better why people might want to actually go down that road. I think that's a huge point as well. Like, Pio just gives you, like you said earlier, the output. It gives you the solution. And if you're a 25 NL player and you're sitting staring at this simulation, you're just going to be sat scratching your head, right? You're just going to be there like, okay, I'm supposed to overbet these combos on the turn, and then I'm supposed to like sometimes use, like students will say to me, why does it use pocket threes? Like on the turn it's like king 10 4 and the turn's a 9. Why is it bluffing pocket threes? It seems like a terrible hand to bluff. Like, what's going on, Pete? And I'll say, well, what were your main flop bluffs? Like when you bet the flop, what were your better flop bluffs? And they'll say, oh, it was like gut shots or open-end straight draws or whatever. Well, what are those hands now? Well, they're pairs or they're straights. Okay, so you can't bluff those anymore. So now we maybe see why it's getting down to a hand like pocket threes. It's kind of hard on a turn that completes everything for you to still have straight draws because your straight draws just got there. So now pocket threes, it only has 2 outs, but it's now one of the better bluffs in your range because it's better to bluff pocket threes than it is to bluff a hand with 0 outs, like 2 undercards to the board or something like that. And like to get to that level of comprehension, you have to literally examine Pio. Like for me, looking at Pio Solver is like studying a wild alien beast and observing what it's doing and being like, we see that the Pio species does this in this situation. We've observed these previously in these situations, and eventually, as an empirical sort of scientist, like you come to understand, but you also need a rational foundation of poker knowledge in the first place, right? And a high level of poker ability. Then you have to be really good empirically at observing, put those two together, and you can use Pio independently. So me, I'm very biased because I can use Pio on its own and I know exactly why it's doing most of the things it's doing after sitting and analysing it. But for a student, they will draw the wrong conclusion, they will replicate it in a spot that's incorrect, and then they'll be overbetting the turn when a straight and a flush just completed, which is really, really bad because your opponent can now have an uncapped range and you can no longer push that nut advantage by increasing your bet size exponentially. Or they'll do it in an SPR spot, like they'll overbet the turn 2x pot when that's almost all in. Well, you didn't have to do that anymore. You're defeating the point of the overbet. So the point is here, like, by using software that takes you through a hand step by step instead of like an absolute solution to a whole game tree, maybe what you're seeing is like little snippets of why you might do one thing in a tiny isolated spot. But I think it's important that people understand those things before they can understand the exact balanced output of the tree at equilibrium, which is like a whole other beast in complexity, right?
Yeah, totally. I agree with all that.
Cool. So, right, let's talk a little bit more about some of the functionality of this program then before we wrap up. So you've said that you've got the hand grid, so when someone's building a range for their opponent, they can just click on 4 or 5 suited, select the combos of that or whatnot. What are the kind of features you would use this for post flop, like, in your opinion? Like, what features did you purposefully put in it post flop that you thought were maybe like unique or weren't being run by every other program like this?
Yeah, so this kind of isn't specific to post flop, but I think one of the things that makes my program like the most differentiated is that it's a web app. So there's one feature where you can create a shareable URL. So if you're studying with a friend, you can click like create shareable URL. You'll get a URL, and then you can send it to your friend, and they'll see the exact same screen that you're seeing. So I have a friend that I study with all the time. His name's also Peter, and we're always sending each other links. And like he had this hand the other day where he like bluff catch the river with pocket threes, and like he sent me a link, and I saw all of his assumptions, and at first I was thinking like, ooh, I don't know if you should have called there. But when he showed me, how his like opponent's range changed from like pre-flop to flop to turn to river, it looked like he was pretty bluff heavy on the river, and like I agreed with his decision to call. So I think that the shareable URLs makes it really easy to study with friends, and also you can post them to poker forums. So that also makes the conversation a lot easier.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of Skype groups and things like that where people often get their wires crossed, and instead of actually, my main like I guess qualm about students that work in like groups of similar ability is that they end up just giving single reasons for things. So some student will post a hand and they'll be like, should I have called in the river here? And then 3 people will be like, easy call, snap call, yep, definitely call. Then one guy will be like, no, you have to fold here because X. And someone else will be like, oh, I didn't think of X. And it's like, well, X has just been given as like one possible reason for folding. Like, you block these missed bluffs or something like this. You block these bluffs. Like, you should fold. But what about the fact that I think the guy is absolutely full of shit in the river, right? So it can get really, really lost and confused because people tend to just accept like mono reasons for things or give single reasons for doing something. Whereas I think if you're actually forced to use a like a kind of blueprint like that, like work your way through the hand street by street, and there is a URL where you're not just sharing one opinion or one reason for a play or asking help. The worst is when they're just like, do I call river? And it's like, that's the most useless question ever. Like, you need to start here with your analysis. You need to show me what you're doing so I can point to where the holes are and correct it. So maybe with a program like Premium Poker Tools, like with your app, people can actually present their work and get feedback on where the flaws are in the thought process instead of just having this like silly dialogue that doesn't really capture the essence of what's going on. Like, usually a poker hand is a lot more complicated than the discussion on a Skype group will make it appear to be to an outsider.
Yeah, definitely. And that's always been a pet peeve of mine too. I kind of get the feeling that people want to sound like smart when they just post like easy call or like easy folds without elaborating. But yeah.
Yeah, it infuriates me because like I'll talk to a student one lesson and then we'll make loads of progress on one area of his technical strategic game, and then the next week he'll roll up for coaching and he'll have this ridiculous thought in place of what I just taught him. So I've just taught him that protection is good and you should protect equity when you have a lot of equity, but your equity is also vulnerable and you have a range advantage, and when all these things are true you should usually bet, which is solid, foundational, GTO. And then he's gone away to his group and someone has said something like, you should check because no worse hand calls and no better hand folds. Well, of course that happens. You've got like a medium strength hand. It doesn't mean you shouldn't bet. Like, you've just taken everything I've said, you've thrown it out the window because people are too willing in poker to accept things that other people say. Like, they just want any feedback sometimes. They want to clear that conscience. They want to feel better about hand. And sometimes I get the impression that any feedback at all for them is enough. And they don't really care if it's right and they don't look into it enough. So I would like to think that programs like yours will help people to actually have to present some kind of working for their answer. Like back in school, you can't just like write the answer down because you could have gone out the back of the textbook. You have to show how you got to that answer, and that's what's really going to make you better at math and better at poker. The same, the analogy applies there.
Right, for sure.
Cool. All right. Well, Adam, this has been interesting. To say the least, it's great to have a sort of entrepreneur on the show who's building software, selling it, and is also passionate about the game. Is there anything else you want to say about this app or just about yourself in general before we wrap up for today?
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe the only thing is just I'm like extremely, extremely receptive to feedback. So any of you guys that want to try it, definitely let me know what you have to think. I'll even, Skype with you and show you how it works if you are struggling to get started. So just that I'm here for you, anything that you need.
Cool. How should people contact you if they want to get a bit more information about the product or pick your brain in general then?
Great question. Sorry, I should have included that. My email is contact@premiumpokertools.com. And that is on the website also if you forget what I just said. Contact@premiumpokertools.com.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, this has been Pete for the Carrot Poker Podcast. We'll be back with episode 79 next week. Thank you for tuning in and run good, guys. If you want any more content from me, check out carrotcorner.com. If you want to be on the podcast like Adam because you have just something slightly unique to talk about as a poker player, preferably you're a poker player or you're at least interested in being one, and secondly, preferably also you have something that maybe differentiates you just very slightly from the rest of the aspiring poker community, hit me up. Carrot on Skype or admin@carrotcorner.com is my email, and check out carrotcorner.com for books, other podcasts, articles, all your other poker needs. Thank you guys, and I'll see you on the next one.